Radio Spaetkauf. Berlin News in English.
Hello, and welcome to a special edition of Radio Spaetkauf. I'm going to be talking with our guests today about graffiti and street art in Berlin and beyond. And today, if you can hear some birds chirping in the background, it's because we are out in, is this Grunewald? Yes, we're out in Grunewald. It is lovely. It is bucolic. There's not a tag to be seen, but I do have a lovely audience who's joined us out here. Thank you guys for coming out. Give yourselves a round of applause. This series, which we're calling RSxEAB, Radio Spaetkauf, in conjunction with the Europäische Akademie Berlin, we're looking topic by topic with a view towards what we'd like to see out of Berlin and other cities, and what we want from our home. We spend a lot of time covering the news over the years, talking about what's gone wrong, if it's crime, if it's a failure to build an airport, whatever it is. And I wanted to take some time to think about what we want from our cities and from our lives in those cities. Today we're talking about graffiti, we're talking about street art, we're talking about, again, like we did in previous episodes, about how we share public spaces. And that's a theme we're developing now, from whether we're talking about the unhoused, whether we're talking about our parks and streets, or whether we're talking about our walls. Today I have three amazing guests that have joined me, and I'm going to introduce them before I start rambling on about things that they know more about than me. Our first guest that I'm going to introduce put together a project called Die Berlin Street Art Map. It's on visitberlin.de. If you go through to that, you'll see a lot of gorgeous artwork by Jim Avignon, who you'll know from our How to F Up an Airport series. He's done a lot of great work for Radio Spaetkauf, so it's a friendly face there. And a friendly face joining us today is journalist Josefine Köhn-Haskins.
Hello, thank you.
Welcome to the show. You know, I had a lot of fun talking with you earlier today as we sort of got to know each other and talk about this topic. And is there in particular a stop on the app or on the map that you maybe think isn't on people's radars when they come to see street art in Berlin?
Yeah, totally. I mean, like the elephant with the world balloon, you might all know, it's like one of the most beautiful murals, but not far from it is the Tommy Weisbecker house. And I think it's like a really interesting project because that goes back to the 70s. So when people were still squatting the houses, and we were talking before about it a little bit too, because everybody thinks that street art is connected to the hip-hop scene and the breakdance scene, but actually it's also part of the punk scene, at least in Berlin as far as I know. On the Tommy Weisbecker house, there are like murals all around the house, and it actually was, the kids there were encouraged by a social worker to paint the house. So go there and look at it.
Is that what the social worker had in mind, or?
I think so. It's very critical. You can see that it's not as professional as many of the other murals maybe in the city, but they have like, what they wanted to express is to change society, and you can really see it, and what's to criticize in society. And I think that's also what street art is about, right?
I think it's certainly sometimes. I'd like to now introduce our next guest. This is Ryan Balmer. He is a tour guide specializing in cultural and social history, and you can find his work and follow him at Berlin_Reguided. Please join me in welcoming Ryan Balmer.
Hello.
So I really, it's very interesting because you're doing tours probably as recently as today, I'm guessing, and sometimes it's street art. I mean, street art's present wherever you're walking, and well, not if you're in this neighborhood. I think I found one tag on my way over here, but Berlin feels unique in its relationship, or if not unique, different from a lot of other cities in its relationship to urban art.
Yeah, I think, as is the case with most things that are seen as being unique to Berlin or special about Berlin or positive about Berlin, whether that was the street art scene or whether it was the previously cheap rents or just the interesting diversity of people who chose to move here. most of these things happen because of bad circumstances. And I think that's what makes Berlin special, is that we had the space to play because of destruction. And we had the space to play because of division and isolation and economic stagnation. And even through the 1990s, people had the space to play and to create and to make art because of the slow process of unification. And I think people who just visit Berlin now for the first time might struggle to understand that, because economically it's a very different place than it was even 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah. Do walls have a different meaning here?
I think they did before. They were definitely worth less. I don't mean worthless. I mean they were worth less because the space behind them couldn't be rented for much, or the space in front of them could not be sold for much. Again, this is a ridiculous idea now if you visit Berlin, but in very recent memory, these spaces were very difficult to sell off or to develop, and that's why they became perfect for street art.
Yeah, my son was talking to some family who was going to be visiting us or via Zoom, and he said to them, "You're gonna think it's really dirty, but it's actually just cool," in reference to our Kreuzberg neighborhood. Our next guest, to quickly get everyone into the conversation, is a muralist and artist named Júlia Mota Albuquerque. Júlia, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You have a mural up in where would we? So people are going to want to go out and look. They're going to pause the podcast right now. Where would we go to see your work?
I have a big mural up on Jakob Kaiser Platz. That's on the U7, and is right by the station. One of the exits. I don't know which one, but one of them. You'll find a big wall there for me. And
okay.
Yeah.
For listeners, can you describe the piece?
Yeah, it's extremely colorful. All of my work is very colorful, and I actually didn't. Who commissioned it was the BSR, which is the trash company, plus Berliner Stiftung Berliner Leben. And so it was a little bit about recycling, actually.
Okay.
It had a theme for this open call. So it just has a lot of characters, and it has some items that they're kind of like passing along together on the wall to kind of bring up reusable
right
packaging.
I guess. Yeah. Idea. I mean, I guess in a way, street art is always a little bit of a reuse, maybe only as a metaphor.
Yeah, I guess.
I think it's interesting, that you are working in this sort of commissioned realm, which separates itself from some of the history of graffiti in the city. Do you, when I've reached out to artists and when I've seen them interviewed today, like it would have been great to have a street artist, a graffiti artist on the show with us as part of this panel. A lot of them want to preserve their anonymity. Okay, so it's one of these things where it makes it difficult. And for those of you here, you'll get to hear a live discussion. And when you tune into the episode, you'll get to hear some of those like blurred voices or anonymous artists or people who I have to find on the streets themselves, because street artists, graffiti artists who aren't famous, taggers, people doing small pieces that you might not notice on the train, people who aren't the one-ups, who aren't the things that are synonymous with this city, I think are a really important part of this process, to me at least, that open-ended ability to transform the space around you, I think is kind of amazing, even if it is destructive maybe to certain other people's perspectives. But we can turn this conversation now to the panel in general. Is there a loss of expression if we shut down or police this art form? Is the art form still have the same sense of expression and politics that it did in the 90s or 2000s?
That's a funny question, because I think at the beginning it was like a really big part of it, right? Kind of the fun to like take a whole train and get away with it without being caught. And And now I think there is like different kinds of street art and murals. There is like the one which is like a little dangerous and you do it illegally and you claim back your part of the city, because that's another discussion we can have. What is destructive, you know? Like
Sure.
what is destructive for people's life and what is destructive for a city?
Right. Is
And-
gentrification more destructive than tags?
Is the Humboldt Forum more destructive than graffiti? Yes.
Yeah, longtime listeners will know we've had an axe to grind with the Humboldt Forum from the beginning. I think the thrill is an interesting part of it, and I wanted to ask Júlia about this because your work is you work in a legal version of public facing murals, but I wondered if like you're doing giant things, you're up on scaffolding. Is there a thrill for you as well?
I'm terrified of heights.
Oh my God. Okay.
So yes, definitely always very scary on the first few days that I'm working. Usually I work for like a week on a big mural. And then on the first few days, it's always like really, it takes me a long time to get used to the height. I'm very scared. And also just because you're up on the street, if it's legal or illegal, people, I mean, I guess if it's illegal, you're probably doing it at night and there's not a lot of people stopping by to maybe criticize your work or talk with you. But when you're doing it during the day, people are actually stopping by to talk with you all the time and they yell at you. And then if you're down, they want to talk with you. It's actually very exciting because of that.
So you're getting like heckled while you're up on a wall?
You get compliments and then sometimes you also get stinky eyes.
Yeah.
I participated on a project in Frankfurt. There was me and like I think 10 other street artists and we're painting a whole courtyard. It was super cool. But I had to arrive a few days before and everything was up with scaffolding, all of the walls. And still I was painting by myself and I was sketching with spray cans. And obviously because I usually paint with brushes and rollers, and obviously spray cans has this connotation of being illegal, and I usually start with it. And a lot of people came to me and they were starting to yell at me because I was doing vandalism, like a vandalism
Right.
kind of thing.
Despite the fact there's like scaffolding
They
and
were like,
yeah.
what are you doing there? And like, there was a lady who even knew about the project and she came and she was like, this wall were just prepared for artists and you were destroying it. Yeah. And I was actually very scared. I even called some people who were participating on the project. I was like, I'm scared that they're going to call the police because it happened 3 times in a row. And I had to tell her, I was like, I'm actually an artist. I just came up a bit earlier than the other ones. I had to show her my design and I had
Right.
to show her what I was doing, because when you start sketching, I'm just doodling with the graffiti, doing a grid, and it looks very ugly and messy. So
Right.
it looks like you could be doing something that was not planned, I guess.
Yeah. Ryan, is there a work like that you could point to in Berlin that you feel encapsulates a bit of the story that you can tell through Berlin's evolution, its relationship to graffiti?
Yeah, it's one that no longer exists, and it's one that was probably the most photographed piece of street art in Berlin's history. It used to be in Kreuzberg on a little bit of empty land that people called Kuvribrache. And it's just along Schlesiestrasse by the Spree. If you're standing on the Oberbaumbrücke facing Kreuzberg, you could see where it used to be. It's now occupied by this really grim yellow brick building. It's kind of disgusting.
And overlooking an empty lot.
Yeah, so it was an empty lot that was, to my knowledge, something that was bombed out during the war. And because that was right on the edge of West Berlin, that part of Kreuzberg was a particularly unattractive place to live in the Cold War era. So no one really built on it, and it was just this abandoned bit of land. By the time I moved here, 2 things had happened. People had begun to increasingly party on the land, but also to live on the land.
Right.
So some people put up tents, they put up shacks. And the other thing that happened was that one of the world's, I think, biggest street artists, a guy named Blue from Italy, was commissioned to paint 2 huge pieces on the wall. And one was a kind of vaguely anti-corporate statement, I guess. It was a guy getting ready in the morning, doing his tie, and he had these golden handcuffs with a golden chain. The other one was much more about Berlin, and it showed these 2 figures with masks, and they were throwing gang signs, west side and east side, and with the other hands they were removing the masks from each other. So it was a nice idea because you could see it from the Oberbaumbrücke, this former checkpoint where the Berlin Wall used to be. And what you saw was this depiction of East and West Berliners getting to know each other. It's very Berlin, very site-specific. And then the land was cleared out, and it was about to be sold off. And one day, we all woke up to these beautiful pieces covered in black paint. And everyone freaked out, including myself. And people were genuinely thinking that it was another example of gentrification, like another Berlin gem that's gone down.
That was the headline first. I remember when the story came out, it was like, oh, these guys, why would this corporate, like, you already bought the land.
Yeah.
Now you got to cover it up?
Well, what transpired was the artist, I think he put it out on his website. He said it was me. He said, I sent my friends to paint over the pieces because I didn't want my work to be used as part of the benefit of buying this land. It was almost like a selling point was that you were buying a bit of land next to one of the most famous bits of street art in the world. So I thought it was really amazing that he wanted his work destroyed rather than to be used in that way. And you could use that as a jumping off point for all these huge ideas we've been talking about in the last little while, gentrification and reclamation of space and everything else.
It is when you start, that was a question, but when you start with artwork that is being reusing a public space or changing a way a public space looks, and the question of who, I guess, owns that artwork. Whether you're with a local website putting up an app, or as a tour guide, or as a photographer, or as like a podcaster wants to cash in a bit, like, you participate in that artwork. At the same time, you mentioned earlier, Josefine, the idea of reclaiming a space. So if you're reclaiming a space, who from?
Well, in our days, actually, there is a lot of commercialism. So lots of the Wohnungsbaugenossenschaften work together with street artists because they actually discovered that, yes, like a beautiful picture on the wall makes people happy when they come home and look at in a city which is very gray in certain parts, not here, of course. And
this part looks nice. There aren't so many murals, is what you mean, yeah?
Yeah. And you can either like it or you can criticize it. And I think there is even like a discussion in the street artist scene, like, is it okay to be commercialized, to get paid for, to make murals and paint for big companies which pay you, like for big sports companies or big fashion companies, because these murals are in Berlin too. Right.
And oftentimes there's nothing explicitly commercial about them. It's not like they may be paid for, but you don't see the logo. You don't know that Deutsche Wohnen, who we'd like to enteignen, has expropriated this art form. Because graffiti is also not necessarily, it's a style. It is a format. It's not necessarily something that's owned or transpired. Or, like, oftentimes, and growing up in like small businesses and restaurants and urban settings, what people would do to avoid having their walls defaced was to get in front of it by commissioning an artist to cover it up as a sort of pro-art anti-vandalism measure, or at least, maybe to put it nicer, just put up a pretty painting, and it might have a sort of side effect of as being, is that make sense to you, Julia, as like someone who works in that field? Like, how do you see people who are doing, shall we say, illicit street art interacting with your work?
No, not yet. Not yet. None of my murals have been tagged, but also none of the murals had tags. None of the walls had tags before. Like, for example, I wouldn't cover a wall that is already tagged because I feel like I'm covering someone else's work.
Right.
Ideally, I wouldn't do that because this is for my understanding, again, I'm not part of the graffiti scene, but this is like someone tagged. It's like kind of they claimed that piece of wall for them.
Right.
And they will tag again your work. So there is no point in some corporation paying an artist to paint over because it will be probably tagged again. And I also don't feel very good covering someone else's work. But I guess I do feel like if I put my work up there and there was no tag and this is a fresh wall, I would also like for them to also respect that and be like, I'm not going to cover that work. But I guess this is we can discuss that. I would love to discuss that with a graffiti
Right.
artist, just to see what they would actually say, because I do not know many graffiti artists that are doing graffiti nowadays. I know people who came from it and now are doing more commercial work. So
Right.
yeah.
Or balancing the two. I mean,
Yeah.
I think even like the classic examples like Keith Haring or people like that who are now just have their work on H&M clothes, but also, managed to make the art public and accessible throughout his career. At least that's the story in the children's book. I've learned everything about him I know from.
Well, he painted in Berlin. There's a YouTube clip that gets taken down every now and again, but there's a clip of him in the 80s, the mid 80s. And he was invited to Berlin, and I think it was the guy who ran the Checkpoint Charlie Museum. It's one of the worst museums in Berlin. And he commissioned Haring to paint this huge mural on the Berlin Wall. But the problem is the Berlin Wall was already covered in murals. And this clip shows this Berlin street artist, graffiti artist, whatever, confronting Haring and saying, "You're covering up my stuff." And to be fair, Haring looks absolutely shocked and really kind of disappointed. But he should have known that he was painting somebody's work. But already, even on the wall itself, you've got this collision between, illegal graffiti or street art and commissioned work.
When you look at the sides of the wall or the traditions of East and West when it comes to street art, graffiti, or also signage, also the way buildings are decorated or painted, is that something that translates through to today? Do you see the effects of the border today in street art?
I don't think so. No, I think increasingly the lines have become more and more blurry in the last few years.
Of course.
And I think that just from working with tourists, I think there's a real sense that they have this idea that East Berlin is the really cool part of the city, and East Berlin is where all the great kind of countercultural stuff is happening. And that's no longer really true. And it hasn't been true for maybe 10 or 15 years.
Right.
And actually, if you go to a neighborhood like Prenzlauer Berg, there is almost no graffiti left because all these buildings have been completely refaced and, to use the slightly alarming German term, sanitized at some point recently.
I mean, is there a destructive element to the aesthetic of the city when we put up walls that are now like new and clean? Are we losing something in this? Yes?
Yeah. There is like one big example. Yeah, like the Brandwände, they disappear and lots of murals disappear too. And there is like one mural which just disappeared. It's called the Pink Man. You probably know it too. It's kind of sad because the wall is still there. Everybody loved it. It was actually really a part of the neighborhood, and it was, amazing.
To take a step back, do you want to explain what you're describing?
Yeah, the person who bought the building claimed that she had to renovate it, and for that reason, the mural couldn't be there anymore. So she just painted over it.
I can't imagine the process by which you would need to paint over something in order to renovate it. You would think, right? If the bricks are gone or there's an empty hole,
I think they stuck some insulation on it. It's something which is, arguably necessary, but probably not. I think we're probably going to come to this at the end, but one thing I think many of us would like to see was greater protection of public art from the Berlin state authorities.
Do you remember the story of the Weltenbaum from Ben Wagin, which they actually moved? It's like one of Berlin's
used to be near the
oldest
zoo,
murals.
and now it's up near the north somewhere.
In Moabit. Yeah. They repainted it because Ben Wagin, some of you might be familiar with him, he's a big artist, and he made one of the first murals in Berlin. It's called the Weltenbaum, and it's also about sustainability and nature and the importance of it. And younger street artists liked that mural so much that when it had to disappear, they repainted it at a playground in Moabit.
Recreated it? Wow. I guess that would be easier than moving it brick by brick. I think that's an interesting question, though, because when we've talked about reusing public spaces in the past, we've talked about the idea of preservation, but now we're also talking about the freedom of expression and an art form that sort of exists in a very free way. So any walls that you do see, although they get claimed, do constantly evolve and change. Is there a dynamic that's hard to kind of codify between freedom of expression and preservation? Is that something that we can actually manage? Is that too deep of a philosophical question?
It is. It makes me think of I think it's Berlin Kids, and they do these letters from top to bottom, and they are at some murals, and I'm not sure if they put it at murals they really like, and they want to say hey, look at this is cool, and they also go to really dangerous spaces where you look at it and think how the hell did they get there?
So you might be referring to Mr. Paradox, who does these things, who's I think sort of excommunicated from maybe the group you're talking about due to whatever. But yes, it does also, you see it sometimes overlap or integrate with commissioned artwork in a way that is sort of interesting, but it's also sort of ubiquitous. But this is now an artist or a group of artists who are interacting in real time via social media, via YouTube, or via maybe, Ryan, even with the tour groups that are coming through?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are cases of artists in Berlin deliberately putting their work on routes that they know that tour guides are going to be taking. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg argument, because the reason that these tour guides go on these routes is because there's street art there in the first place. But then some artists know that if they hit that route more often, with especially with paste ups, something that could be maybe then sold in a gallery or something like that, then they're going to get as much coverage for their piece as possible, as much exposure as their piece. I don't really have a problem with that necessarily. I think that these artists should and could be making money for themselves as well. So why not? But it does mean that the street art has appeared in a less organic way than one would imagine.
Right. But again, that's also in our imagination. When tourists come here to see graffiti, are they looking for certain artists or pieces, or are they just sort of wanting to look at a wall with, did they have a sense? Because if you've got artists who are trying to maybe achieve fame or get notoriety or increase their presence, is that part of the interaction from the tourist side?
It is a bit. I think that, Blue was one of the biggest artists in that scene maybe 10 years ago, and all of these pieces except one are gone now. He's one of the only really big names. Oz Gemios, and I've absolutely mangled that pronunciation. I hope there's no one from Portugal or Brazil here.
Well,
but
Julia, but I'm also mangling her name every time I say it.
Sorry. I think it means the brothers or the twins, right? Okay. Well, they're pretty huge. Right?
It's Os Gêmeos.
That's exactly what I said.
They are
Did you just figure out what he was talking about?
Yeah, I was at the beginning. I was a little bit what? Cool. But they're from Brazil.
They're from Sao Paulo, I think, right? Yeah, they're huge. And so some people, when you show them that, they're like, oh, those guys. Otherwise, most of the big murals in Berlin are not really done by really internationally famous people.
You forgot Shepard Fairey.
Oh yeah, sorry, that big mistake. Yeah, Shepard Fairey. Although I'll be honest with you, when I've shown the Shepard Fairey pieces to especially younger American students recently, I was shocked at how few of them knew who he was.
Oh wow!
Even when I said he's the Obey guy.
What about Jim Avignon?
No.
And
it was just a pity because I think Avignon's work's really good. But internationally, he doesn't have the same impact as someone like Shepard Fairey.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting, the Shepard Fairey murals and this is no reason for me to chime in on the podcast at this point, but the work, like you're talking at in Kreuzberg there by Hales's tour, is that the one?
There's two. There's one there and there's one in Schöneberg, quite close to the Nollendorfstrasse.
That work that I'm familiar with there, it feels almost like someone doing a Shepard Fairey. There's something about it where I'm like, it's
quite mawkish. It says "make art, not war," which I guess is a fine sentiment. But
yeah.
It's, come on. I think it's not his finest work. The one in Schöneberg's much better. The Manifest Destiny one.
Right. Something that came up in what you were just saying accidentally but also explicitly in terms of all the names you mentioned is that they're all men. They're all men, and you said these guys, that can be a gender neutral word, but in this case it really isn't. And I wonder if partially in the muralist world or the designers who are bringing the walls, if you find, Julia, I'm speaking to you as someone who is not a man, is that a world where you're seeing a more gender balance, or is that also male dominated?
I would say that it's still male dominated, but you still find, that we can also talk about, I guess, the commercialization of street art festivals and other things like that. But if you see the street art festivals happening today, will always be the majority male of the people who are getting invited to paint these walls. Although like today you can see a few of them that are like trying to invite more female artists, but I think there are a lot. Sometimes it's just because it was so male dominant for so many years, so many decades, that only now that I think like there are a lot of female artists coming up, and they're slowly taking more space in the media and everything else.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's also, if it's a work that begins anonymously and you then have to go through the gatekeeping of whoever decides is going to be the next big name, maybe representation operates differently in that world from whether you're tagging. I mean, there was the artist Klit, who is prolific here in Berlin, and I'll never forget when the rumors went around that it was a man doing it and how disappointed everyone was that made the news. But I also see, like, within your work, like a lot of representation, because your work is representational, and you see, like, it did remind me a little bit of someone who did like Diego Rivera, where you see these great faces and where the work was really political, even when it was commissioned by auto industry or whatever. Is that part of what you're doing? Is that part of what people hire you for?
Yeah, I think I'm slowly getting more political in my work. It's a little bit hard to put yourself out there like this, especially when you're painting on the street. I think also being a woman painting on the street comes with way more tension than being a man when you are there. Could
you explain what you mean?
I mean, maybe it's just your impression, but I do think people question you more when you are up there, and people do ask, "What are you doing? Are you? Is this legal? What are you doing up there? Like, are you here alone?" Things like this. And I do like to represent a lot of women in my work, and especially Black and brown women, I would say. I'm from Brazil, so I feel like that's very important. And I mean, I'm not sure if people are commissioning my work because of that. I'm slightly new still on the scene, but I do think they commission me because I have a very, very bold, very colorful kind of style. And I think that's usually like what they're looking for when they find me. But I hope that slowly becomes actually maybe because of that.
That it has a reciprocal effect.
Yeah, like representation. And also, I also want to talk about other topics that I just feel like I didn't have the opportunity to.
Right.
Yeah.
There's been other spaces that have sort of changed hands or changed, the artwork has evolved here. Teufelsberg has been a space that's sort of gone through different iterations. Josefine, do you have?
Yeah, they just had a
nodding.
festival where they just invited female artists. You were there?
I
Yeah.
was there.
Oh, did you paint something? What did you paint there?
I painted the tower. It was like the Jambalaya Tower. I don't know. It was right by the entrance. It was really fun. And I actually painted as a homage to a Brazilian artist called Tarsila do Amaral. I don't think people would know her, but she's very famous in Brazil. And I just kind of redid one of her paintings, but in my style, I guess. Yeah.
Cool. So there was a festival. So they were painting fresh artwork as part of the festival.
Yeah. And it's a special holiday in Berlin because Berlin has not many holidays like any other places in Germany. We get a special holiday on March 8th. This is like World's Women's Day.
Right. Because we didn't take up as many Catholic things. We're not sure what they are, but so they gave us that one. Yeah.
Exactly.
So it took place on the 8th. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And on that day at Teufelsberg, I'm sure that Ryan can talk a lot about Teufelsberg and the history of it because it's an interesting place. But they did a festival there, a street art festival, female power of mural, like something with female power and murals and art and amazing. Yes. And
right. But it was also now it's a space which is curated.
Yeah.
In this case for cause feminism, but for other things as well. Whereas, I mean, Ryan, maybe did you take people to Teufelsberg?
I've never taken anyone on a tour there. Like anyone who moved here a long time ago, we used to break in all the time because there was 3 or 4 generations of fences with thousands of holes in them and some really slow-moving security guards. But and it was a genuinely dangerous place to hang out. It was great, but it was definitely pretty sketchy. And it's one of these things. I'm glad it's still there. It was a lot of fun to break in and run around,
right?
And I'm sure a lot of people had a lot of fun painting there.
Right, there was the fabric of the sort of listening station, which
absolutely.
was part of it.
It's an astonishing, layers and layers of history there, from the SS Academy to the rubble to the Americans spying on people. So yeah, it's got a bit corporate now. You have to pay entry and all the rest of it, but I don't mind that because I think it preserves it, and I think it makes it possible for festivals like this to take place.
Right,
and that's always the balance. I
right.
think that I'd rather have it like this than not have it at all.
You mean as opposed to it becoming a condominium, or
exactly, or just getting knocked down because it was a genuinely crumbling place.
Yeah, that
quite
would
dangerous.
be sad. That would be really sad, because like in 2012 they also had a festival there that was organized like not financed by commercial stuff. They just invited tons of street artists from all over the world, and to merge with the Berlin scene. And most of the murals there are still from that time when you climb up the ladders. So yeah, it's good that they keep it up.
It reminds me, so a space that we discussed on the last episode of this series was Gleisdreieck Park, which was an open wasteland, was a place where people would party or do whatever they want, and including street art and graffiti. And there still is a huge presence of graffiti there, but it's sort of now not exactly a wild space. I use the term legacy, but there is the legacy paint shop or graffiti, or I don't know, lifestyle store. I don't know what to call it, over by Yorkstrasse, but they're part of maintaining a wall you can paint at and spaces there. And so I don't know how that falls into this spectrum of sort of.
Well, it's run by a guy who actually comes from the scene in the 80s, who grew up, in the divided city and was part of the breakdance scene. I talked to him once. His name is Ibo. I think he's also one of the people who doesn't really want to get in front of a microphone, but he loves his art, and he thinks like that tagging is real street art and graffiti. So that's what he wants the legacy wall to be at Gleisdreieck Park, which is next to a basketball court and skaters, and it brings lots of youth culture together. And if you go to his store, you can get like a little official note that you're allowed to paint there. And for some reason, he doesn't want people, maybe you can explain why that is, like with metallic colors, because then it's probably hard to paint over it or something like that. So there are certain rules.
Right. And graffiti itself, in reading up on this, there's people point to it as being like an environmental hazard. I'm sure some of these paints are toxic. I'm sure compared to the automobile, it's probably not a huge deal, but it is something that maybe it's like any art form and awareness grows in. Sorry, Julia?
No, I'm sorry. I actually don't know anything about that.
I definitely don't know.
I would love to make it more sustainable, because every time that I'm painting murals, I always wonder like how do I actually get rid of this trash in a way that actually I don't produce that much trash when I'm just living my normal life.
Right.
But when I'm like painting a mural, even though I don't paint with spray cans, I paint with brushes and rollers, but the paint buckets and everything, it always ends up like you need to throw that away, and then what do you do?
Right. Yeah. Maybe, I don't know. You can it's those coffee pods or whatever. Again, it's probably not something that we have to worry about in the grand scheme of things. But
it is. Go back to the cave times.
Yeah, sure. That's some of our earliest forms of communication, I guess, are graffiti. As we sort of start winding our way towards the end of this conversation, we've talked a little bit about where we've been and where we're at. I love the way my neighborhood looks. I love the tags. I love, in some ways, the cruder, the less evolved, the way that you get to go to maybe a corner bar and see an open mic while someone's working out a song for the first time, or go to a student art show or watch a short film. Like, you get to interact with this art in a totally uncurated way. And sometimes it's maybe just, the last time I picked up a spray can, it was bad, and it was like trying to be political, and I was failing really. But like, I'm also glad that the statute of limitations is probably up on that, so I can talk about it. But it is I've caught kids in the middle of the night, and I now don't look like a guy that's like gonna like what they're doing, and they go, well, I'm like, it's fine. Just has any of you got actually any? Can any of you really do this? Can any of you write for real? And then we have fun with them. But at the same time, my housemeister likes to get up early in the morning and like every day paint blue paint over the tags, which I also love watching that. I love watching that come and go, and those, like, it doesn't quite match the paint anymore because it's faded. And that's just like part of what I look around the way, like, where I grew up, it smelled like skunks all the time. But like now I smell skunks and I'm like, aw. And that's how I feel about a lot of this work. So I don't know, is there a way to go forward and balance this? Is it, or am I being like, I like the old, is this just another Berlin? I like the way it was, and these times aren't available anymore.
I think like street art is like Berlin, because Berlin is a city of change, and street art is an art form of change, and it's constantly changing, and like every piece is somehow still connected to some kind of history in Berlin. Might be the punk scene, the graffiti scene, like maybe like the first art form, maybe reclaiming the city, maybe like the Berlin Wall and the East Side Gallery. It's in movies like in Himmel über Berlin,
of
like
course.
when that angel wakes up under the piece of Thierry Noir. It's just beautiful, and that will be forever. So I like the change of it.
So as things become codified, is there a danger in, we kind of touched on a little bit, as corporate money becomes something that can reward a lifetime of work? Like, I mean, I don't want to take tobacco money, but I'd maybe take a little bit of oil money for the podcast. I don't know. I feel like a little bit Robin Hood when I get a piece of that. It doesn't, but they're not offering, so we don't really have to cross that moral boundary. Do any of you see a issue with that?
Yes and no. I think that most art forms in the last few hundred years have always been funded by some pretty dark money.
Right, the Renaissance.
Most of the great composers were patronized by some horrible inbred pedophile royal, and so this is nothing new. The Sex Pistols' first record was put out on a record label owned by Richard Branson, who's obviously a monster. So
allegedly,
whatever, a monster.
Yeah, okay.
I don't think that's actionable. So I think whichever counterculture or subculture it is, it's always been tainted by money. It's very difficult to make art that really hits the kind of mainstream without it being backed by some pretty grim money. I'd like to see some more care taken when it comes to some of the murals painted in Berlin. I'd like to see less corporate sponsorship from, for example, companies like Deutsche Wohnen, who we talked about earlier. But otherwise, taking a bit of money from a sports company, or Levi's is a good example in Berlin, who paid for murals a few years ago. I don't think it's the worst thing. And I think that it means that we have this art to look at in the first place.
And I mean, if so much of street art comes out of a space where there was, like we spoke to earlier, like an absence of money, or like, not to reference Keith Haring again, but he started off doing white on the black, where there were no ads were hung because no one was bothering to spend money on ads in the train stations back then. I mean, we saw just during lockdown, we saw an explosion of train art because the trains were all parked, and it's kind of, they're sadly slowly being cleaned up, but the trains coming out of lockdown were gorgeous for a while there.
Well, I think that's the thing, is that we can try and talk about ways of preserving it or moving forward with it, but the good thing is that nothing we could say here is really going to make any difference, because it's an organic thing, and it's for the most part from the ground up, and it doesn't rely on people giving it permission or paying for it. And ultimately, some of the best stuff does come from people who are taking risks, and
but
sometimes that evolves into more kind of mural work and work that's commissioned, and that's also totally fine. But most of it does emerge from the bottom, and that's the way it should be.
I mean, but there's, on the same side, when you want to make it there's a democratic or free or an accessibility when you take it upon yourself to go out and do it, but that also requires you to take that risk. So you've got people who are out there getting arrested or being chased or stuck working in ways that then limits access to people who can't take those risks. I think if your citizenship is not in order, if you have family if there's a lot of reasons why someone could, because it's illegal, not participate in this form of expression.
But that's just one of many paths. You were talking about your path being different from a graffiti writer becoming a street artist. So you said your background was in illustration and then street art. That's also a completely legitimate path into this, and that's one that's not risking your livelihood or your life, like the train bombers sometimes are.
Sure,
that's also a completely legitimate path into it.
Right, but it's not. I think it is whether or not that's a path towards, like tags or things that are smaller pieces, or practicing or learning to express yourself, and through that, is there, that maybe there's a way to decriminalize that. I mean, we're seeing, when we talk about cultural changes or things like that maybe that's, if we've had, in Berlin for a long, long time, a sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge relationship to marijuana consumption. And now recreational marijuana consumption is legal, although it's made very little change, I'd say, in the day-to-day operations of it. I mean, is this something where we can also look at the laws and the policing, which, when you look at something like the broken windows idea or any of that, has always been about keeping people down rather than keeping walls clean. And yeah, I'm not sure if you really want it, but I mean, there are lots of legal walls in Mauerpark, Park im Südkreuz, and there are official workshops, there are tour guides who actually do a street art tour, and then you can do a graffiti workshop afterwards. There's like street art projects for youth who live on the street. It's cool. It brings the community in. But I think street art also lives from that slight illegal thing, like these ups you see sometimes in the city. UP up there. Like, I don't think this is like allowed and legal, and they asked to do it before. So I think both of it has to exist. Well, they're sort of something that straddles the world between like the street art and the sort of whatever illicit, and a brand which can operate and become something profitable or commercializable.
I think, again, I'm not a graffiti artist.
Yeah,
but just from my understanding of it, it comes from maybe not right now, maybe it's not like that anymore, but it started in the 70s and 80s. It's a time that it didn't start, but this was the graffiti boom, and this was a time that every country in the world was going through a lot of struggles. It's a form of art for people who were not heard. It's for a form of art for people who want to be heard, and they want to reclaim that space that they were never afforded to have. And I think maybe it's a little bit like you said. I don't want people to get arrested, but I do think it kind of thrives a little bit on the illegal aspect of it.
Sure.
And just to add a little bit to your question in terms of a change on the graffiti or street art mural scene, in terms of the commercialization, I think would be very interesting to actually have these companies who are paying for these murals. Me, obviously, as a commercial artist who actually lives off of that, right. I would say it would be very interesting for these companies to maybe sponsor a mural and not meddle with the artist's intention. Let the artist create. You can sponsor it. You can say that you sponsored it, and maybe something like that. But don't say that's what we want to see, because I feel like that then it doesn't curate the urban space, right? And then lets the artist kind of express what they want to. And I feel like that could be a very interesting way to move forward with the commercialization of street art, I guess. I don't know.
I think in terms of the economics of what's different about the 70s or 80s or the 90s in Berlin and today is the economic imbalance isn't just urban poverty. It's the sort of the flip where people are being squeezed out, and sort of the reclaiming of a space isn't necessarily, instead of being against blight, it's against gentrification, and so it is sort of a different, although very somehow it's somehow the same, but I think that the economics of it and the policing of it are also very different, because if the people concerned with stopping graffiti are cops or whomever, that's very different from massive real estate corporations. And I think that's how we have to sort of start to reconsider this. But we're also in a world where now Berlin has a street art museum. And so, like, what does that mean? Is that a success or a failure of that art form?
Yeah, not only in Berlin.
Yeah, of course.
There is like so many street art museums.
Is this like every city has one now?
Yeah, almost no.
Yeah. Well, I'm not anti-museum. I'm a little anti-museum, but not really. Again, so just to get us back to a place where we can start to wrap this up, and I can eat dinner. When you think about an aspect of what you want from Berlin, from the places you live, and how they interact with street art, interact with street artists, and interact with graffiti, do you have a sense of a direction that would be important to go, or where you'd like to see? Júlia, can we start with you?
Yes, but I would just get back to my previous answer and say, like, in terms of the commercialization, I would just like to see more freedom to the artists in that way. I feel like, this is a repeated phrase that we see a lot, that people say, oh, I don't like graffiti, but you say, what about public ads? They also look terrible on the street.
Yeah.
And you also didn't get your permission to put them there. They just put it.
Yes.
And I live in Neukölln, and I pass by Hermannplatz every day, and there is like a projector and a huge wall there with like some advertising that is like terrible all the time. And it's really, I hate it.
Yeah.
And every time that I pass by, it's like, oh, this is such a great wall for a mural. And if it needs to be legal, and if it needs to be like a commercial project, I would love for a corporation to pay someone to paint that mural, and don't meddle again with the design. Let the person like be themselves, paint their art, and then they can say, we sponsor this mural, we are sponsoring public art. How lovely that is.
Right.
Public art is always great. It's uncurated. It's anyone can stumble upon on the street. You don't need to go to a museum, and you don't need to pay entrance for that. I think that would be a great direction.
Yeah. It would. Yeah, my only fantasies of having wealth is to buy the ad space on that projector and put nothing up. Like, if I had infinite money, I'd like, fancy hotels I think are great too, but shutting that projector down would be so satisfying. And the proliferation of spaces that are taken over by ads is amazing. The rental cars that now have TVs beaming out at you as you walk by them is got to be one of the most offensive eyesores. But maybe in 2 generations, people will be like, it's so cool. We have a museum of ads now.
It's horrible.
Yeah. Ryan?
Yeah, I think, just going back to what I said earlier, I think much more care with corporate sponsorship. And also more intervention from either the city or the state authorities regarding the preservation of murals. We have a Denkmalschutz system for a reason, and I know that was only given to the East Side Gallery about maybe 10 years ago.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, it's why big chunks of it were removed before then. And I think that's something that should be given to some mural art in the city as well.
I think it would be great if, like, politicians, Berlin, like everywhere in the world, people would listen to that original claim of street art, that the city belongs to everybody and should be built for everybody and not just for the people who have money to put up big commercials. I think that would be pretty amazing.
Because even if we're not meddling with the artist's intention, maybe that corporation is still picking the artist, and that's still something. Maybe we can even say, like, you're not allowed to do that either. I mean, maybe there's a step in that direction. And one last thing, as we give our audience something to do as they walk around, did any of you have another artwork or a space that you wanted to recommend people go to see that we haven't come across already?
One place, if you're like really interested in big and beautiful murals, is like Art Park Tegel, because it's like on these huge walls, and I think it's also artists from all over the world, and Jim Avignon again, which I have to promote. And and if you want to learn more about the beautiful murals, we also have an app called About Berlin app, and there's like a nice street art special which guides you through Friedrichshain and Kreuzberg, all the places Ryan won't bring you because he just brings small groups there. So if you want to be like your really small group, just with yourself and your phone and the guide, yeah,
excellent.
Please download it.
Thank you for joining us. We'll put the link to that in the show notes. Julia, is there any places that are special to you?
I would say, what is it, Nollendorf Platz or the U-Bahn around there? I mean, there's a lovely murals there, and I feel like there you can also see like very common Berlin names around there. But if you don't want to see commercialization, I'm not sure if they were paid, but definitely that was curated. Everything around there curated by Urbanation, which is the street art museum. But it's lovely. I actually believe that they also curated Tegel around that area.
Yeah. They work together with Gewobag and
Yap Studio, which is the Pro. It's also who I worked for on the mural at Jakob Kaiserplatz. So yeah, they do. I mean, still curated, but lovely work and lovely selection of artists, I would say.
Yeah, I think if any of you are in Kreuzberg anytime soon, there's a really good one which is tucked away quite close to Oranienplatz on Naoni-Strasse or Naoni-Platz. And it's a memorial mural for a graffiti writer, beatboxer, breakdancer named Maxim. And he was from Kreuzberg. So he was the children of Gastarbeiters or Turkish guest workers. He's one of the first MCs to emerge from the Turkish German community. He was a member of a gang called the 36 Boys, who were partly formed in response to neo-Nazi violence in the early 80s. And he was a really respected member of the community. And he was killed by a older white German man who was acquitted of the charges. And there's an amazing mural for Maxim on Naoni-Platz. So you've probably been in that neighbourhood, but you haven't walked down that quiet little street. But that's what I'd recommend. And it's by a Berlin-based artist called Stereo Heat. And it's one of my favourites in the city.
Very cool. Yeah, to my two senses, I take some time to appreciate the tags and find some that you follow that aren't so famous, because it becomes a really fun way to navigate your city in any city as you see them. Like when I first moved here, I was drawn to NHS. It's the letters of my high school, but it was just sort of weird when I was feeling lonely. I'd be like, oh, okay, NHS. Didn't like my high school, but that's kind of fun. And it was just everywhere. And a lot of times it was just the letters, not a very complex mural or anything, but they're still sort of friends of mine. And now I went on my own project to go around and photograph alphabets for each sort of like Keats or different areas. And so then you sort of get a sense of how the city is shifting or changing by seeing the density of the art or the types of art. And I think it's a really fun thing to do, the way people go birding. You can go urban birding as well, but take a second to look up from the phone. It's also a good excuse to just work on your posture. So we've got the link to the Visit Berlin, as you suggested, and we'll go through. And I think that app is really fun, and it features Jim's artwork, which is great. Julia, if people want to see your work or learn more about you, where should they go?
Yes, it's Land of Julia, so literally Land of Julia, and that's my website, that's my Instagram, and that's all of my work. It's under this name.
Excellent. Ryan, where do we find more of you?
You can find me on Instagram. It's Berlin_reguided. And there's usually a couple of reels every week about this stuff and other aspects of Berlin's history. So follow me there.
Excellent. And of course, you're already listening to Radio Spaetkauf, so no need to plug it. But I would encourage you to come out to a live show. We don't always have them in this amazing green bird-filled. We have lots of nice dense sound today of helicopters, and I hope we captured all of that. But it's fun to interact. And as we continue this project with Europäische Akademie Berlin, we're going to be examining other public spaces and how we interact with them. And we're also going to spend some time revisiting some of these topics, along with some interviews that we can't get on on the air especially for this one. It's been a pleasure. You can support us through our website if that's something that you're interested in doing, and you can come out to live tapings. Thank you very much to all of my guests. Thank you for coming out. Thank you to the live audience here. Give yourselves a round of applause. To the EAB, to all our partners, editors, to Joel, and everyone else back home. I'm Dan. Thank you so much.
Radio Spaetkauf. Berlin News in English.
Thank you so much for listening. That was part 1 of our graffiti episode. In part 2, we'll hear from some voices and perspectives that were missing in this conversation. There's a live taping this Sunday, August 4th at House of Color, doors 3 p.m. Link to the event is in the show notes on our Instagram or at the House of Color website, hoco.world. We deeply appreciate your ongoing support via our Steady, as well as your one-time donations. Links to those are on our website. For Radio Spaetkauf, this is Daniel Stern.